The ballroom at the Ashford Meridian Winter Gala smelled like white roses and old money, and Daniel Marsh had a black velvet box sitting against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He kept touching his jacket pocket every few minutes, the way a man checks for his wallet in a crowded subway car. Except this wasn't a wallet, and the woman he intended to hand it to wasn't his wife. Vivian Cross stood 11 feet away, in an emerald gown, laughing at something the chief marketing officer had said, completely unaware that in about 4 minutes, in front of 230 guests, 6 members of the board of directors, and one very patient woman standing near the west entrance in a plain navy dress, her entire world was about to end. Elena Marsh was not supposed to be at this gala. She was not on the guest list. She had not been invited, had never once been invited to an Ashford Meridian function in the 4 years her husband had worked there, because spouses of senior analysts, she'd been told more than once, weren't really part of that circle. She stood near the coat check with a manila folder tucked under her arm, and inside that folder was 11 months of her husband's life laid out in bank statements, hotel confirmations, and a forensic accountant's signature. She watched Daniel check his pocket one more time. She watched Vivian Cross throw her head back and laugh, and she watched the MC step up to the small stage to introduce a very special moment that the CEO's office had scheduled for exactly 8:45 p.m. Elena checked her phone. 8:41. She had 4 minutes to let this happen exactly the way it was about to happen. 4 minutes to remember that patience, real patience, the kind that costs you sleep and dignity and 11 months of pretending, was the only currency she had left, and she was about to spend every cent of it in front of every person in that room. She had not always known how this story would end. 11 months ago, she hadn't even known there was a story at all. Before we get into how this one played out, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. And tell me something honestly. Have you ever had to get even with someone who thought you'd never find out? I want to know. Elena Marsh was 34 years old, and for most of her adult life, she had built things quietly. She ran a small marketing consultancy out of a converted spare bedroom in the Charlotte, North Carolina, craftsman she and Daniel had bought together in 2019, a 3-bedroom on Belmont Avenue with a porch swing neither of them had gotten around to fixing, and a mortgage they'd split 50-50 since the day they signed the papers. She had 3 steady clients, a regional dental group, a boutique hotel chain out of Asheville, and a non-profit that ran after-school programs in East Charlotte. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was hers, and it paid the bills, and it let her be home when it mattered. She had met Daniel 9 years earlier, at a friend's engagement party in Raleigh, back when he was a junior analyst at a regional bank, and she was still finishing her MBA. He'd made her laugh with a joke about spreadsheet formulas that shouldn't have been funny, but was delivered with a kind of self-deprecating confidence that she'd found disarming. He proposed on a hiking trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains 4 years later, on one knee, with a ring he'd saved for over 18 months because he wanted to buy it outright. No financing, so it means something. They married in October of 2016 at a vineyard outside Hendersonville. 200 guests. Her father gave a toast that made everyone cry. Daniel danced with her grandmother, who was 81 and had a hip replacement, and he did it slow and careful, and Elena remembered thinking, watching them, that she had married a genuinely good man. For a long time that had been true, or true enough. Daniel worked hard. He was ambitious in a way Elena respected. He had a 5-year plan, then a 10-year plan, then a plan for what he called the C-suite runway, and he pursued each one with the kind of discipline that got him promoted twice in 6 years. In 2021, he left the regional bank for Ashford Meridian Financial, a mid-sized wealth management and fintech firm headquartered in a glass tower on South Tryon Street, managing just under $4 billion in client assets across the Southeast. He started as a senior financial analyst, reporting into the corporate strategy division. Within 18 months, he'd been pulled directly onto the CEO's special initiatives team, a small, hand-picked group of 6 people who worked most closely with Ashford Meridian's chief executive, Vivian Cross. Vivian Cross was 45 years old, a former investment banker who'd taken over as CEO of Ashford Meridian in 2020 after the previous chief executive retired abruptly amid a minor accounting scandal that never quite made the local news. She was, by every account Elena had ever heard, from Daniel, from company holiday parties, from the Charlotte Business Journal profile that ran the year she took over, brilliant, demanding, magnetic, and divorced. Her marriage to a hedge fund manager named Gordon Ashby had ended in 2019, reportedly amicably, reportedly because the travel wore it down, and she had thrown herself into rebuilding Ashford Meridian's reputation and revenue with a single-minded intensity that the business press loved to write about. Daniel talked about her constantly, not in a way that ever struck Elena as strange at first. Bosses came up in dinner conversation the way weather did, a fact of the day's climate. Vivian wants the Charlotte County Pension Fund pitch reworked by Friday. Vivian thinks the Q3 numbers need better framing before the board sees them. Vivian said I have real potential, that she wants to groom me for something bigger. Elena had been proud of that. She'd told her sister Renata more than once, he finally has a boss who sees what he's capable of. She meant it kindly. She had no reason not to. The trips started in the spring of the previous year, March, then May, then a longer one in July, always framed as client acquisition travel, a fintech conference in Austin, a due diligence trip to review a potential acquisition target in Nashville, a strategic offsite with the Special Initiatives team in Charleston. Daniel came home from each one energized, talking about deal structures and market positioning, with the kind of enthusiasm Elena associated with him falling in love with his career all over again. She didn't think anything of it. Why would she? He'd always loved his work. She loved that he loved it. What she did not know, what she would not learn until the following January, 10 months after the first of those trips, was that on each of those occasions, the Special Initiatives team that traveled was not 6 people. It was 2, Daniel Marsh and Vivian Cross. Elena thought often, in the months that followed, about how normal that year had felt from the inside. She remembered a Tuesday in April, when Daniel came home from a strategy retreat in Nashville and brought her a small bottle of bourbon from a distillery tour, telling her, laughing, that Vivian had insisted the whole team try the barrel-proof batch and that half of them had regretted it by dinner. She remembered a Sunday morning in June, coffee on the back porch, when Daniel mentioned that Vivian had asked him to sit in on a board prep session because she trusts my read on the numbers more than half the senior team, and Elena had squeezed his hand across the table and told him she was proud of him, genuinely, the way a wife is supposed to be proud of a husband whose hard work is finally being recognized. She remembered buying him a leather portfolio for his birthday that September, engraved with his initials, because he'd mentioned offhand that Vivian always noticed who showed up prepared and who didn't, and Elena had wanted him to walk into every meeting looking like exactly the kind of person his boss was describing. None of it had seemed like anything other than a marriage in a good, steady season. Daniel still remembered to take the trash out on Thursday nights. He still called her during his lunch break twice a week, out of habit more than obligation, just to ask how her client calls had gone. He still fell asleep some nights, with his hand resting on her hip, the way he had since their first year together. It was, Elena would later say to Renata, the strangest part of the whole thing. That betrayal on this scale did not require the marriage around it to visibly rot first. It could sit quietly underneath a marriage that still, on the surface, looked exactly like it was supposed to. Trigger 2 goes here, after the wrong is revealed. The wrong did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way water gets into a foundation, slowly, through small cracks Elena hadn't known to check for, until one day, the whole structure was compromised, and she simply hadn't noticed the moment it happened. It started with a receipt. In late January, Elena was doing what she'd done every January for 6 years running, gathering documents for their joint tax return, a ritual that involved spreading folders across the dining room table and cross-referencing credit card statements against categories in a shared spreadsheet Daniel had built years ago, back when he still cared about the two of them managing money as a team. She found a charge on the joint Ashford Meridian corporate reimbursement account, an account Daniel had access to for expensing client travel, which occasionally, when the company was slow to reimburse, they'd float from their own joint checking and then get repaid, for a hotel in Charleston. The Vendue, a boutique property on East Bay Street, $412 a night, for a stay in July that Elena remembered clearly because Daniel had told her it was a 2-night strategic offsite. The charge was for 4 nights. She almost let it go. Almost. Corporate trips ran long sometimes, but something about the exactness of the date, a Thursday to a Monday, a length of stay that didn't match a single conference agenda she could find publicly listed for that week in Charleston, made her open her laptop and look a little closer. What she found over the following 6 weeks, working quietly in the evenings after Daniel had gone to bed, piecing it together the way you'd solve a puzzle you weren't sure you wanted the picture of, was this. Between March and December of the previous year, Daniel Marsh had taken 9 trips, categorized internally at Ashford Meridian as Special Initiatives Client Development Travel. Of those 9 trips, 7 overlapped, night for night, with hotel reservations, restaurant reservations, or spa charges under the name Vivian Cross, charged to a corporate American Express card that Ashford Meridian's finance department, Elena would later learn from a source inside the company, had flagged internally twice for unusual pairing of expense codes, both times without follow-up, because the flags required sign-off from the CEO's office, and the CEO's office was Vivian Cross. The total value of those 7 trips, reconstructed later by a forensic accountant Elena hired, came to $18,430 in company funds, separate from a further $6,100 in charges that had been run through the Marsh's own joint checking account for the portions Daniel claimed the company was slow to reimburse. Money that never came back, money that Elena had personally watched leave their joint savings without knowing what it was actually paying for. But it wasn't the money that broke something in Elena's chest when she finally understood what she was looking at. It was a message thread. In early February, 13 days before that Valentine's gala, Elena had been transferring photos off Daniel's old phone, a routine backup before trading it in for an upgrade, something he'd asked her to handle while he was in back-to-back meetings, when a notification populated on the screen from an app called Signal, one Elena had never seen him use before. Curiosity, and by then a low, cold suspicion she hadn't let herself name, made her open it. The conversation went back 14 months. Elena read perhaps 40 messages before she had to put the phone down and sit on the edge of the bed for 11 minutes, staring at the closet door, before she could pick it back up. Vivian had written, "On January 3rd, Gordon never once made me feel like this, like I was actually being seen and not just managed." Daniel had written back, "On January 3rd, you deserve someone who sees the whole picture. I've been telling you that for a year." On February 1st, 13 days before the gala, Vivian had written, "The board thinks I'm handling the Ashby settlement conservatively. I'm not. I'm just handling it quietly, so nobody asks questions before Valentine's." Daniel had responded, "Same plan on my end. Nobody asks questions until it's already done. I want it to be a surprise she can't say no to." Elena had read that message perhaps 9 times before she understood what it meant. Her husband was not talking about a business deal. He was talking about a proposal. 14 days from that message, on February 14th, the same date, Elena would later realize with a nausea she still couldn't fully describe, that she herself had already booked a table at Battery Park Book Exchange and Champagne Bar, their favorite restaurant, to surprise Daniel with a second honeymoon trip to the Amalfi Coast she'd been saving for since October. Her husband intended to propose to his CEO. There was more. A message from Vivian on January 22nd read, "The ring is beautiful. I can't believe you found something that matches the one from my grandmother, without me ever describing it to you." Elena did the math without wanting to. $6,100 had disappeared from their joint account in unreimbursed client development charges over the previous 10 months. She would later learn, through the credit card statement she eventually subpoenaed as part of the divorce discovery process, that on January 19th, 3 days before that message, Daniel had made a $4,800 charge at a jeweler on Providence Road called Solane and Ferris, paid from a home equity line of credit against the house on Belmont Avenue. A line of credit that required both spouses' signatures to open, which Daniel had opened using a power of attorney document from 2019, one Elena had signed years earlier so he could handle a single closing appointment while she was traveling for a client, a document he had, apparently, held onto and used for something it was never intended for. Her husband had used their house, the house they owned together, the house with the porch swing they'd meant to fix, as collateral to buy an engagement ring for another woman, and he had planned to propose to her on the same night, in the same city, while Elena believed she was planning the best surprise of their marriage. She went back through the signal thread twice more that week, forcing herself to read every message in order rather than skim for the worst of it, because she needed to understand the shape of the whole thing, not just the sharpest edges. What emerged was a relationship that had clearly built slowly, deliberately, over more than a year. Vivian complaining, early on, about the isolation of running a company where everyone either wants something from you or is afraid of you. Daniel positioning himself, message by message, as the one person in her orbit who wanted neither. By the summer, the tone had shifted from confiding to intimate. By the fall, Vivian was writing things like, "I keep telling myself this is reckless, and then I remember how long it's been since reckless felt this good." And Daniel was writing back things that made Elena's stomach turn, precisely because they sounded like things he had once said to her, 9 years earlier, on a hiking trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She also found, buried further back in the thread, a message from October in which Vivian had written, "Gordon's attorney keeps pushing on the Ashby settlement numbers. If it gets messy publicly right now, it could rattle the board right before year-end reporting. I need this handled quietly." Elena did not fully understand what that meant at the time. She assumed it referred to Vivian's divorce from her ex-husband, Gordon Ashby, finalized years earlier, and filed the detail away without much weight. It would matter more than she expected, later, once Denise Okafor explained what handled quietly had actually involved. After what Daniel Marsh and Vivian Cross did to Elena, on a scale of 1 to 10, how angry are you right now? Drop your number in the comments, because it's about to get a whole lot more satisfying. Elena did not confront Daniel that night. She did not confront him the next morning, or the morning after that, or at any point over the following 11 days. She would later describe this period, to the one friend she eventually told everything to, as the quietest she had ever been in her entire marriage, and the most alert she had ever been in her entire life. The breaking point did not arrive as a scream or a slammed door. It arrived on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after she'd read those messages, when Daniel came home from work, kissed her on the cheek the way he did every evening, poured himself a glass of the Cabernet they kept for Fridays even though it was a Tuesday, and said, entirely without irony, "I actually think this might be the best year of my career." Vivian's talking about restructuring the executive team in the spring. She said she wants people around her she can really trust. Elena stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup she had no appetite for, and said, "That's wonderful, honey," and meant every syllable of it as a lie so precise it felt like surgery. That was the moment, not the messages, not the ring. The moment she watched her husband lie to her face with such ease, such total comfort, that she understood he had stopped seeing her as someone whose reality mattered. And she made a decision, standing at that stove, stirring soup she would later pour down the drain. She was not going to cry in front of this man. She was not going to scream, or beg, or ask him why. She was going to find out exactly what he had done, exactly what Vivian Cross had done, exactly how much company money and personal deception had gone into building this, and she was going to make sure that when it all came apart, it came apart in a way neither of them could contain, spin, or survive with their reputations intact. She thought of her father, a retired contracts attorney, who used to tell her when she was a teenager arguing with a friend, "Don't get mad, get specific." She had never understood, until that Tuesday night over a pot of soup she couldn't eat, how much power was actually in that sentence. She went to bed that night beside Daniel, listening to him fall asleep within minutes, the way he always did, untroubled, breathing evenly. A man with no idea that his wife lay 6 inches away from him, running through a mental inventory of every document she would need to gather over the coming weeks. She remembered thinking, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, that there was a strange kind of clarity in finally knowing exactly what she was dealing with. For 3 days, she had felt like she was drowning in something shapeless. Now, lying there making a list in her head, bank statements, the power of attorney document, the jeweler, the home equity line, her own attorney, her own bank account, she felt, for the first time since reading those messages, something closer to steady ground. She did not sleep much that night, but she did not cry either. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, she got up quietly, went downstairs, and wrote the word, due diligence, at the top of a fresh legal pad, underlined it twice, and began, in small, careful handwriting, the first list of what she would need. It was, she would say later, the calmest she had felt in a week. Daniel Marsh had just crossed a line in Elena's mind, though he had no idea it had happened. No going back for her, even if he never found out. Have you ever had that moment, where you stopped being the bigger person and started planning instead? Tell me about it in the comments. Elena spent the next 4 days doing nothing that looked like revenge. She went to client meetings. She made dinner. She let Daniel talk about Vivian's vision for the company without her face ever betraying a single flicker of what she now knew. What she was actually doing, in the hours after he left for work and before her own client calls began, was building a folder, a real one, physical and digital both, that she began labeling, privately, due diligence. The first person she called was her sister, Renata, who lived in Winston-Salem and worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized family law firm. Elena didn't tell Renata everything on that first call. She wasn't ready to say the words out loud yet, but she asked a single, careful question. If someone used a joint home equity line without their spouse's real knowledge, using an old power of attorney, to buy something personal, what would that be called, legally? Renata, without asking why she wanted to know, answered plainly. Depending on the state, that could be several things. In North Carolina, if it's for a purpose unrelated to the marriage and it depletes marital assets, family court would likely call it dissipation of marital assets, and it matters a lot in equitable distribution. You'd want documentation, dates, amounts, what it was actually spent on. Elena wrote the phrase down on a legal pad. Dissipation of marital assets. Documentation, dates, amounts. She then did something she had never done in her marriage. She pulled the prenuptial agreement out of the fireproof box in the hall closet, the one they'd signed in 2016 at Daniel's father's insistence, since his family had real estate holdings in the mountains that he wanted protected. Elena had barely read it at the time. She remembered feeling almost insulted by it, back when she was 25 and certain nothing would ever go wrong. She read it now, cover to cover, twice, at her kitchen table at 11 at night, with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside her. 2 clauses mattered. The first, any assets acquired during the marriage that were not explicitly designated as separate property under the agreement would be split under North Carolina's standard equitable distribution framework, meaning the house, the joint accounts, and Daniel's Ashford Meridian retirement contributions and vested stock options accrued during the marriage were all on the table, not protected the way Daniel's family had assumed his premarital assets would be. The second, buried in a section on marital conduct affecting distribution, which Elena's own attorney had apparently insisted on adding years earlier as boilerplate she'd never expected to need. A clause stating that in the event a court found evidence of financial misconduct or dissipation of marital assets by either party during the marriage, the offending party's share of marital property could be adjusted downward to compensate the other spouse for the loss. Elena read that clause 4 times. She had signed her own weapon 9 years earlier and never known it. She hired a family law attorney the following week, not Renata's firm, since Renata worked there and Elena wanted a clean wall between them, but a firm 2 towns over, in Concord, North Carolina, recommended by Renata precisely because of that distance. Holloway and Pierce, a boutique practice known for handling high-net-worth divorces involving business assets. The attorney she retained, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priscilla Ann Doyle, listened to Elena's initial account for nearly 90 minutes without interrupting once, then said the sentence that would guide the following 10 weeks of Elena's life. Before we file anything, we need a complete, defensible record. Not suspicion, not screenshots you took in a panic. A record that would survive a deposition. Can you get me access to the joint accounts, the home equity documentation, and anything showing when he actually used that power of attorney? Elena could. And over the following weeks she did. Carefully, without ever tipping her hand, using nothing but records she was legally entitled to as a joint account holder and co-owner of the house. She pulled 24 months of statements from the home equity line, cross-referencing every draw against dates on Daniel's calendar, which synced automatically to a shared family iCloud account he'd set up years earlier for scheduling purposes and never thought to remove her from. She found the Solane and Ferris jeweler charge. She called the jeweler's customer service line, posing as a client following up on an insurance appraisal for a ring my husband purchased in January, and confirmed, through a young sales associate who had no idea what she'd just done, the item description: a 2.8-carat oval solitaire in a rose gold setting, appraised value $5,200, custom size to a ring size. The associate read off the order: 6.5. Elena's own ring size was 7 3/4. She had never told Daniel her exact number before, not that it mattered. The associate mentioned, unprompted, that the customer had brought in a photo of his fiancée's grandmother's ring for a style reference, which lined up precisely with the signal message Elena had already read. It wasn't her ring. It was never going to be her ring. Daniel and Vivian were building something they thought no one could see. Do you see where this story is heading? Drop your prediction in the comments before the plan fully unfolds. The forensic accountant came next, a semi-retired CPA named Harold Whitfield, who took on select private engagements for family law attorneys, referred by Priscilla Doyle with the simple assurance, Harold doesn't miss anything, and he doesn't talk. Elena met him twice at his home office in a converted garage in Matthews, North Carolina, both times bringing a fresh accordion folder of bank statements, expense reports she'd requested under her legal right as a joint account holder from the bank directly, and the signal messages she'd screenshotted and preserved with timestamps before Daniel could ever discover she'd seen them. Harold Whitfield spent 3 weeks reconstructing a clean, dated ledger. $18,430 in Ashford Meridian corporate travel expenses that correlated, night for night, with hotel and restaurant charges under Vivian Cross's name, none of which matched any publicly documented conference, acquisition target, or client meeting. Elena's own research, cross-checked against public SEC filings, press releases, and industry conference schedules, could substantiate. A further $6,100 pulled directly from the Marsh's joint checking account under the guise of float reimbursements that were never repaid. The $4,800 jewelry purchase, funded through an unauthorized home equity draw, using an expired power of attorney. Total, $29,330 in marital and, potentially, corporate funds, diverted over 11 months. This is a clean number, Harold told her, sliding the final report across his kitchen table. And clean numbers hold up. Messy accusations don't. This will hold up in family court. And depending what you decide to do with the corporate piece, that 18.4, it might hold up somewhere else entirely. Harold walked her through the report page by page, the way she imagined he had walked hundreds of other clients through hundreds of other quiet catastrophes over his career. He'd flagged every transaction with a source document, bank statement page numbers, credit card cycle dates, the confirmation email from Solane and Ferris that Elena had forwarded him after her call with the sales associate. He'd built a simple timeline exhibit, a single page with a horizontal line running from March to December, hotel dates stacked above it, and corresponding client development expense codes stacked below, so that anyone looking at it, a judge, an attorney, a board member, could see in 4 seconds what had taken Elena 6 weeks of quiet, careful nights to piece together on her own. The thing people get wrong, Harold told her, closing the folder, is they think the money is the whole story. It's not. The money is just the part you can prove without asking anyone to trust your memory of a conversation. Everything else, the messages, the timeline, the way it felt, that's real too. But this, he tapped the folder, this is the part nobody can talk their way out of. Elena knew exactly what he meant. She had already been thinking about the corporate piece for 2 weeks. She had a source inside Ashford Meridian, someone she hadn't gone looking for, but who had, in a strange twist of timing, come looking for her. Her name was Denise Okafor, the director of internal audit at Ashford Meridian, whom Elena had met, coincidentally, at a company spouse's holiday dinner 3 years earlier, and had stayed loosely in touch with since, the two of them bonding originally over a shared frustration with corporate seating charts. In late January, before Elena had even fully processed what she'd found, Denise had sent her a strange, careful text. Random question. Has Daniel mentioned anything about expense audits lately? Nothing urgent, just something crossed my desk. Elena had not answered that text for 6 days, needing time to understand what it might mean. When she finally did respond, she asked Denise to meet her for coffee, off Ashford Meridian property, at a diner in Noda that neither of them had any professional reason to be at. Denise told her, carefully, that 2 of the special initiatives expense reports Daniel had filed the previous year had been flagged by the automated expense system for unusual pairing, travel dates and lodging costs that exceeded standard per diem guidelines for the stated purpose, and that both flags had required sign-off from the CEO's office to clear, which Vivian had personally approved within hours both times, an unusually fast turnaround for flagged items that typically sat in review for a week or more. Denise, who had no idea about the affair and had simply noticed an accounting irregularity that troubled her professionally, said she'd been debating whether to escalate it to the audit committee of the board, but worried it would look like she was targeting the CEO without solid cause. Elena did not tell Denise everything that day. She told her enough, that she had reason to believe there was a personal relationship involved that would explain the pattern, and that if Denise ever did decide to escalate, Elena might have documentation that would corroborate the timeline. Denise, visibly relieved to have her instincts validated rather than dismissed, said she would take it to the board's audit committee chair, a longtime independent director named Franklin Osei, the following week, quietly, through the right channel. Elena asked only one thing in return, that nothing be filed or escalated before Valentine's Day. Denise, curious but not pressing, agreed. Denise also told her something else that day, almost as an aside, that Elena filed away without fully understanding its weight until weeks later. The Ashby settlement Vivian had referenced in that October message wasn't a personal divorce matter at all. It was the code name, inside Ashford Meridian's finance division, for an ongoing dispute with Vivian's ex-husband, Gordon Ashby, over a hedge fund co-investment vehicle the two of them had structured together years before their marriage ended. A vehicle that Ashford Meridian had quietly continued servicing under Vivian's direction long after the divorce, in a way that 2 junior compliance staffers had privately questioned but never formally escalated, worried it would be seen as second-guessing the CEO's judgment on a legacy account. Denise had only recently connected the dots herself, cross-referencing the account's servicing fees against the same finance system that had flagged Daniel's expense reports, and she suspected, though she was careful to say she couldn't yet prove it, that Vivian had been directing preferential fee waivers to the Ashby vehicle in exchange for Gordon's continued silence on unrelated matters from their divorce. "It was," Denise said, "probably a separate problem from your husband's expense reports, but it's the kind of separate problem that makes an audit committee take everything else more seriously once they see the whole picture." Priscilla Doyle, when Elena relayed this development, was characteristically measured. "You don't need the corporate side for your divorce case," she told Elena. "Your case is airtight on the marital dissipation piece alone. But if the corporate investigation happens to conclude around the same time as your filing, that's not something either of us controls, and it's not something either of us needs to engineer. It's just what happens when the truth has more than one thread attached to it." Elena appreciated, more than she could have explained at the time, how careful Priscilla was about that distinction. More than once during their February meetings, Priscilla reminded her, gently but firmly, that the goal was never to punish Daniel or humiliate Vivian for its own sake. The goal was to make sure that whatever happened to either of them happened because of what they had actually done, documented and dated and true, not because Elena had engineered a spectacle. "Juries and judges and boards all respond to the same thing," Priscilla told her once, over coffee in her Concord office. "Not anger. Certainty. The moment you start performing your anger, people stop trusting your facts. So we don't perform anything. We just make sure the facts are impossible to look away from when the time comes." Elena understood exactly what her attorney meant, and exactly what she wasn't saying out loud. They weren't going to manufacture a scandal. They were simply going to make sure that when the scandal that already existed came to light, through Denise's audit finding, through the board's own oversight process, it would land at the moment of maximum consequence for both Daniel and Vivian, rather than the moment of maximum convenience for them. Priscilla Doyle laid out the strategy across 2 long sessions in early February, using a whiteboard in the back conference room of Halloway and Pierce, that she covered in a color-coded timeline once Elena had finished walking her through everything Harold and Denise had each independently uncovered. "The mistake most people make in your position," Priscilla told her, capping a marker and setting it down, "is they think they have to choose between the marriage and the workplace, go after him personally, or go after the affair professionally, one or the other. You don't. These are 2 separate systems, with 2 separate sets of consequences, and the beauty of your situation is that both of them are already true. We don't need to force anything to happen. We just need to make sure both systems are moving on their own schedules, so that neither Daniel nor Vivian ever gets the chance to get ahead of either one." The plan that emerged over the following 6 weeks had 3 separate tracks, each one moving forward independently, each one designed to converge without ever technically depending on the other. The first track was legal. Priscilla Doyle prepared a complete divorce filing. Grounds for divorce in North Carolina requiring either a year of separation or fault-based grounds, and given the documented affair and financial dissipation, Priscilla built the case around marital misconduct affecting equitable distribution, with Harold Whitfield's forensic report as the backbone. She also prepared, in parallel, a formal notice to freeze the joint home equity line of credit, cutting off Daniel's ability to draw further funds, and a request for a temporary restraining order on marital assets, not accusing him publicly of anything, simply protecting what remained of the marital estate through standard, unremarkable legal channels that Daniel would have no reason to suspect were coming until the papers were served. The second track was financial protection for Elena herself. On Priscilla's advice, Elena opened a private account in her own name at a different bank entirely, began redirecting her consulting income there rather than the joint account, and, critically, had Harold Whitfield draft a formal demand letter to Ashford Meridian's HR department requesting reimbursement of the $18,430 in improperly categorized expenses that had originated from, or been floated through, the Marsh's joint funds, a letter Priscilla would hold in reserve, ready to send the moment it became strategically useful. Priscilla also had Elena quietly document, in a notarized affidavit, her own contributions to the household over the course of the marriage, her consulting income, her share of the mortgage payments, the renovation costs she'd covered out of pocket the year they redid the kitchen, not because North Carolina law required it for equitable distribution, but because Priscilla wanted a complete, unimpeachable record of Elena's own financial conduct sitting directly beside Daniel's, so that any comparison a judge might draw would only ever run in one direction. "We're not just building a case against him," Priscilla explained during one of their February sessions, sliding a fresh legal pad across the table. "We're building an unambiguous picture of you, a spouse who paid what she owed, kept clean records, and never touched a dollar that wasn't hers. That picture does more work in a courtroom than people think." Elena also spent 2 afternoons that February with Renata, off the clock, going through the mechanics of how service of process actually worked in North Carolina, who could serve the papers, how quickly, whether it could be timed to a specific hour of a specific morning. Renata explained that a licensed process server could typically execute service within a defined window if given advance notice and a confirmed location, and helped Elena identify a server Halloway and Pierce had used before. A retired sheriff's deputy named Wallace Pruitt, who had a reputation, Renata said, for being polite, fast, and absolutely unshakable about deadlines. Priscilla booked Wallace for the morning of February 15th, 9 o'clock sharp, at Ashford Meridian's headquarters on South Tryon Street, timed deliberately for Daniel's arrival at work, rather than his arrival home, so that whatever the fallout was, it would begin in front of the same professional world he had spent 11 months protecting, instead of his marriage. The third track Elena handled almost entirely herself, and it was the one that required the most patience of all. She kept living her life exactly as she had before. She kept up appearances of a woman planning a Valentine's Day surprise, because that woman was, in fact, real. Elena genuinely had booked the trip to the Amalfi Coast, genuinely had reserved the table at Battery Park Book Exchange, and had decided, somewhere in the third week of her research, that she was not going to cancel a single piece of it. If Daniel wanted to spend February 14th planning to propose to another woman, Elena was going to spend it exactly the way she'd intended. Except now, she knew things he didn't know she knew, and that asymmetry was the entire architecture of her plan. In late January, Denise Okafor called Elena again, this time with more information. Franklin Osei, the audit committee chair, had reviewed the flagged expense reports and asked Denise to prepare a formal summary for presentation to the full audit committee. The meeting, Denise mentioned almost in passing, had been scheduled for the week of February 16th, 2 days after Valentine's Day. Elena asked Denise one more question, carefully, the way you'd handle a piece of glass you weren't sure was sharp. "Is there any company event before the 16th? Anything public, where the board would already be gathered?" There was. The Ashford Meridian Winter Gala, held every February 14th at the Grand Bohemian Hotel downtown, a black-tie charity fundraiser for a regional financial literacy nonprofit that the company had sponsored for 11 years running. Every board member attended. Every senior executive attended. And, Denise mentioned, almost as an afterthought that landed in Elena's chest like a stone dropped into still water, Vivian's office asked the events team last week to build in 15 minutes near the top of the evening program for what they're calling a personal announcement. Nobody knows what it is. People are guessing it's a promotion announcement. Elena knew exactly what it was. She spent the first week of February finalizing every piece of her own plan around that single date. Priscilla Doyle agreed to have the divorce filing and the temporary asset freeze ready to be formally served the morning of February 15th, the day after the gala, so that nothing in the timing could ever be construed as Elena manufacturing a public confrontation rather than simply, finally, protecting herself through proper legal channels. Denise Okafor agreed to make sure Franklin Osei and the rest of the audit committee received the finalized summary of the flagged expenses no later than the morning of February 14th itself, so that when the committee members walked into that ballroom that evening, they would already be carrying, in the backs of their minds, a quiet, unresolved question about their CEO's judgment. And Elena made one final decision, one she deliberated over longer than any other piece of the plan. She was going to attend the gala herself. She was not on the guest list. She had never been invited to an Ashford Meridian function in 4 years. But Denise, when Elena finally told her the full truth in the first week of February, the affair, the ring, the timing, all of it, sat quietly for nearly a full minute before saying, "I can get you a seat at my table. Nobody will think twice about a director's +1." Elena had cried, briefly, for the first time in nearly a month, not out of sadness, but out of something closer to gratitude, the specific relief of no longer carrying something enormous entirely alone. She did not plan to make a scene. Priscilla Doyle had been explicit about that, and Elena agreed completely. Nothing she did that night could look like sabotage, humiliation, or public confrontation, because anything that looked engineered would undermine both the divorce case and the credibility of Denise's audit findings. Elena's role, as she and Priscilla defined it in their final meeting before the gala, was simple almost to the point of anticlimax. She would attend. She would carry, discreetly, a folder containing copies of the divorce filing and the asset freeze notice, already stamped and dated for service the next morning, purely so that when Daniel saw her there, he would understand instantly and completely that she knew everything, without her needing to say a single word to explain it. And she would let everything else, the board's private knowledge of the audit flag, Vivian's own choices, Daniel's own choices, simply happen in front of her, the way water finally breaks through a dam it's been quietly eroding for months. The night before the gala, Elena laid out the navy dress she'd chosen weeks earlier, deliberately plain, deliberately unremarkable, nothing that could be read afterward as an outfit chosen to draw attention, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder Harold and Priscilla had helped her assemble one final time. 31 pages. Bank statements, the jeweler's confirmation, the timeline exhibit with its single clean horizontal line, and, clipped to the front, the notice of equitable distribution filing stamped for service the following morning. She did not plan to hand it to anyone at the gala itself. It was, she realized as she sat there, less a weapon she intended to use that night, and more a kind of anchor, proof to herself, if her nerve wavered under the chandeliers and the string quartet, of exactly how much true, documented reality stood behind whatever she was about to walk into. She thought, too, about Vivian, a woman she had never met, had no personal grievance against beyond the obvious one, and found she felt something more complicated than hatred. Denise had mentioned, in one of their coffee meetings, that Vivian had built Ashford Meridian's recovery almost entirely on her own reputation for discipline and control, that she'd been profiled twice by the local business press as the person who'd saved the firm after the previous CEO's quiet scandal. Elena wondered, briefly, whether Vivian had ever imagined that her own carefully built reputation could unravel over the same kind of quiet, undocumented shortcut she'd once, presumably, cleaned up after someone else for. It did not soften what Elena intended to let happen. It only made the whole evening feel, to her, less like an act of vengeance, and more like the simple, unglamorous arithmetic of consequences finally catching up to a ledger that had been left unbalanced for too long. Trigger 5, after the payoff lands, should reference Elena by name and ask for a verdict. The gala unfolded exactly the way Elena had imagined it, and nothing like she had imagined it, both at once. The Grand Bohemian's ballroom had been done up in the same theme Ashford Meridian used every year: white roses, silver candelabra, a string quartet tucked into the corner playing arrangements of songs that were 40 years too old for half the room to recognize. Elena arrived at 7:50 with Denise, was introduced to the three other people at their table as a friend from outside the industry, and spent the first 50 minutes doing precisely what she had told herself she would do, eating very little, drinking exactly one glass of champagne, and watching the room the way she imagined a surveyor watches a piece of land before deciding where to build. She watched Franklin Osei speak quietly with two other board members near the bar, their body language unhurried but unmistakably serious. She watched Daniel, across the room, laughing at something with two colleagues from the Special Initiatives team, entirely unaware of the folder resting against her knee under a white tablecloth. She watched Vivian Cross move through the room, the way CEOs are trained to move through rooms. A hand on someone's shoulder here, a two-sentence compliment there, never lingering long enough to be pulled into a real conversation. The practiced choreography of someone who had learned exactly how to be seen by everyone and truly known by almost no one. At 8:30, the string quartet shifted into something livelier, and the events coordinator began quietly ushering people back toward their tables, the signal that the evening's formal program was about to begin. Elena felt her pulse tick up, not from nerves about what she might do, but from the strange, suspended sensation of having spent 11 months building toward a 15-minute window, and now finally arriving at its edge. Denise reached over and squeezed her hand once under the table, without a word, and Elena understood it as the only kind of encouragement either of them could safely offer in a room full of people who had no idea what either of them knew. At 8:45 p.m., the MC, a local news anchor Ashford Meridian hired every year for the event, stepped to the small stage at the front of the ballroom and said, with the easy warmth of someone who had no idea what he was about to be part of, "Before we move into this year's fundraising highlights, I understand our CEO has a personal moment she'd like to share with all of you tonight." Vivian Cross walked to the stage in her emerald gown, and Daniel Marsh followed 2 steps behind her, the velvet box no longer in his pocket but now, visibly, in his hand. Elena watched from Denise's table, 7 rows back, near the west entrance, the folder resting on her lap beneath the white tablecloth. Daniel got down on one knee. The ballroom, full of 230 guests who had no context for what they were witnessing, made the collective sound rooms make in that moment. A soft gasp, scattered applause starting before anyone fully understood, phones lifting to record. Vivian's hand went to her mouth. Daniel said something Elena couldn't fully hear from that distance, something about the last year changing everything, about finally being with someone who sees the whole picture. The exact phrase, Elena registered with a strange, clinical detachment that he had written to Vivian in that January 3rd message. And then Franklin Osei stood up from his table near the front. Elena had not orchestrated this part. She would learn only later, from Denise, what had actually happened in the hour before the gala. Franklin Osei, having reviewed the audit summary that morning, had quietly informed 2 other board members, enough to constitute, informally, a quorum of concern, that he intended to request an emergency executive session immediately following the evening's program, regardless of what the personal announcement turned out to be, because the flagged expense pattern, once laid out clearly, raised questions about the CEO's fitness to continue in her role that could not wait until the 16th. He had not expected the personal announcement to be a marriage proposal to a subordinate employee, while that same employee's expense reports sat under formal audit review. But when it was, he did not sit quietly. "Vivian," Franklin said, his voice carrying with the particular authority of a man who had chaired boards for 20 years, "before this goes any further, I need the executive committee to speak with you. Tonight. Privately." The room's applause died into a confused, uneven silence. Vivian's face, Elena would later admit to Renata, was the single most satisfying image she had ever watched in her life, not out of cruelty, but out of 11 months of carrying something enormous entirely alone, watching it finally, publicly, become someone else's problem too. Daniel, still on one knee, still holding the ring, looked up and saw, for the first time, Elena standing near the west entrance of the ballroom. He did not need her to say anything. She watched his face move through recognition, then confusion, then a slow, sinking comprehension that arrived roughly 4 seconds after he registered that his wife, who was not on any guest list, who had never once been invited to an Ashford Meridian event in 4 years, was standing in that room, in a plain navy dress, holding a folder, watching him propose to his CEO. Elena walked toward him, not fast, not dramatically. She had rehearsed nothing, because Priscilla had advised against rehearsing anything. Say as little as possible. Let the paperwork do the talking tomorrow. She stopped 4 feet from where Daniel still knelt, the ring box now hanging limply from his hand, and she said the only sentence she'd decided in advance she wanted to say, quietly, just to him, not to the room. You'll be served tomorrow morning at 9. Everything's already documented. The expenses, the equity line, the ring. Harold Whitfield's report is 31 pages. I'd get a lawyer of your own before then. Around her, the ballroom had fully broken into confused murmuring, guests unsure whether they were witnessing a scandal or simply an awkward personal moment gone sideways in public, phones still lifted, a few laughing nervously, most simply staring. Elena caught, in her peripheral vision as she turned to leave, the exact moment Vivian Cross's practiced composure finally cracked. Her hand, still raised near her mouth from the proposal a minute earlier, now pressed flat against her sternum, her eyes moving rapidly between Franklin Osei, Daniel still kneeling on the small stage, and the 2 other board members now rising from their seats. It was, Elena thought, the first time all evening Vivian looked like a person rather than a performance. She turned and walked out through the west entrance, past the coat check, into the cold February night, and did not look back to see what happened next, though Denise texted her 20 minutes later that the board had escorted Vivian Cross into a private conference room off the ballroom, that the gala had ended early, due to unforeseen circumstances, and that by the following Monday, an internal memo would go out announcing that Vivian Cross had stepped down effective immediately, by mutual agreement with the board, to pursue other opportunities. Corporate language, Elena understood, for a resignation extracted under the threat of a forced termination, the board was fully prepared to execute once the audit findings were formally presented. Elena sat in her car in the Grand Bohemian's parking garage for nearly 20 minutes before she felt steady enough to drive, not crying, not shaking exactly, but aware of an enormous, unfamiliar quiet settling into her chest where the 11 months of careful vigilance had been. She called Renata from the garage, and the 2 of them talked for the entire drive home, Renata asking questions and Elena answering them slowly, methodically, the way she'd learned to talk about the whole ordeal over the past 6 weeks. Facts first, feelings after, if there was room left for feelings at all that night. There wasn't, quite. That would come later, in smaller doses, over the following months. Daniel was placed on administrative leave that same week, pending an internal review of the expense irregularities tied directly to him, and resigned 3 weeks later, rather than face formal termination proceedings, a resignation that came with no severance and a mandatory repayment agreement, negotiated by Ashford Meridian's legal department, requiring him to reimburse the company $18,430 in improperly categorized travel expenses over 18 months, garnished directly from any future wages he'd disclosed to them. Backed by a signed promissory note his own new attorney advised him to accept, rather than risk the company referring the matter to local prosecutors for internal fraud. Denise told Elena, weeks later, that the internal review had turned up one more detail neither of them had anticipated. 2 of the special initiatives trips Daniel had booked had been approved not by Vivian directly, but through an assistant in her office who had simply been told the travel was pre-cleared, without ever seeing an actual authorization on file. That gap, a process failure as much as a moral one, became part of Ashford Meridian's own internal remediation plan, a new two-signature approval requirement for all C-suite adjacent travel that the board adopted that spring, specifically citing recent findings without ever naming Daniel, Vivian, or the affair in the public-facing board minutes Elena later found, out of curiosity, in a routine SEC filing search. It was, she thought, a strange kind of legacy for 11 months of secrecy to leave behind. A compliance policy, quietly written into a company's governance framework, that neither of the two people responsible for it would ever be credited with causing. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Priscilla Doyle's case, built on Harold Whitfield's clean, dated ledger, and the marital misconduct clause Elena had once dismissed as insulting boilerplate, resulted in a settlement that gave Elena the house on Belmont Avenue outright, 60% of Daniel's vested Ashford Meridian retirement contributions accrued during the marriage, and a court-ordered restitution of the $4,800 spent on the ring, plus interest, to be paid directly to Elena as compensation for dissipated marital assets, a number the family court judge approved without hesitation once Harold Whitfield's report was entered into evidence. Daniel's attorney, a young associate at a general practice firm in South Charlotte who had clearly never handled a case with this much documentation stacked against his client, attempted at the first mediation session to characterize the home equity draw as a joint asset used for a joint purpose, since the marriage was still legally intact at the time. Priscilla had anticipated the argument and answered it with a single exhibit, the signal message from January 22nd, where Vivian described the ring as matching her grandmother's without ever having described it to Daniel. Proof, Priscilla argued, that the purchase had been made with the specific, personal intention of using marital funds for an asset never intended to benefit the marriage in any way. The mediator, a retired district court judge named Constance Everhart, who had seen every version of this argument over 3 decades on the bench, did not take long to rule the characterization unpersuasive. Daniel's attorney did not raise it again. The mandatory financial disclosures that came with the divorce also surfaced something Elena hadn't fully anticipated. Daniel's promissory note with Ashford Meridian, requiring repayment of the $18,430 in misappropriated travel expenses, was structured to be satisfied first from any marital assets awarded to him in the divorce, before wage garnishment would begin, which meant that a significant portion of what remained of Daniel's half of the marital estate went, almost immediately, toward repaying the very company he'd used to fund the affair in the first place. Priscilla mentioned this to Elena once, dryly, over their final case review meeting. There's a kind of justice that doesn't need anyone to design it. Sometimes the paperwork just does that on its own. Now that you've seen how it all played out, was Elena justified in how she handled it? Or did she go too far? Give me your honest verdict in the comments. Elena kept the house. She fixed the porch swing herself, that spring, with a YouTube tutorial and a neighbor's borrowed drill, and she found the work oddly satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. The specific, physical satisfaction of repairing something with her own hands after months of repairing something else entirely with patience and paperwork. She did not speak to Daniel again after the divorce was finalized, beyond the necessary logistics of splitting a shared storage unit and forwarding a handful of pieces of mail that still occasionally arrived under his name. She heard, secondhand, through Renata, who heard it through a mutual friend, that Daniel had taken a role at a smaller regional firm in Greensboro, a step down in both title and salary, and that Vivian Cross had left Charlotte entirely, resurfacing 8 months later in a consulting role in Atlanta that made no mention, in her new firm's public bio, of her tenure at Ashford Meridian. Elena's consultancy grew that year, not because of anything dramatic, but because she had more time and clearer focus than she'd had in a long while. She picked up 2 new clients by summer, including, in a detail she still found quietly amusing, a small wealth management firm across town that had recently poached 2 disgruntled former Ashford Meridian employees and wanted help rebuilding a marketing presence with more transparency than their previous employer had modeled. She and Denise Okafor stayed close after that year, meeting for coffee every few months, no longer needing to meet off Ashford Meridian property, since Denise had left the company by autumn as well, recruited by a competing regional bank that specifically cited her audit work. Work she still couldn't fully describe in detail, given the confidentiality terms of her departure, but which her new employer clearly understood the value of. Elena never asked Denise for the full internal story of what happened to Vivian Cross after the board's private session that night, and Denise never offered more than she felt comfortable sharing, but Elena gathered, from what little came up in conversation, that the audit committee's findings on the Ashby settlement arrangement had ultimately mattered more to the board's final decision than the affair itself. A detail that struck Elena, when she thought about it, as oddly fitting. It was never really about jealousy. In the end, it was about a pattern of judgment that finally had enough documentation behind it to be impossible to ignore. Harold Whitfield sent Elena a card that December, something he told her he did for exactly one client a year, the ones whose case I still think about after it's closed. It read, simply, "Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to notice what was done to them. You did the noticing yourself. That's rarer than you think." Elena kept the card in the same fireproof box as everything else. She thought sometimes about whether it had been worth it. The 11 months of careful silence, the folders, the forensic accountant's kitchen table, the decision to walk into a ballroom she wasn't invited to and say 9 calm sentences instead of screaming the truth she'd earned the right to scream. She always landed in the same place. It had cost her something to be that patient, that precise, that controlled while her own marriage quietly ended around her. But it had also given her something back that she hadn't expected. The certainty, for the rest of her life, that when it truly mattered, she was capable of building a plan more careful and more durable than anyone had built against her. She still keeps Harold Whitfield's original report in the fireproof box in the hall closet, filed neatly behind the prenuptial agreement she once read as an insult, and now keeps as a reminder. Not out of bitterness, just as proof, to herself, that specificity, dates, amounts, documentation, patience, had turned out to be the only kind of revenge that actually held up, in family court and everywhere else that mattered. Sometimes, sitting on the porch swing she'd fixed herself, Elena thought about the version of that Valentine's Day she'd originally planned. The trip to the Amalfi Coast, the table at Battery Park Book Exchange, the surprise she'd spent months preparing for a man who had, it turned out, been preparing an entirely different surprise of his own. She had canceled the Amalfi trip in March, once the divorce filing was underway, but she went anyway, that October, alone, using the refund credit and a little more besides. She stood on a cliffside path above Positano on her first evening there, holding a glass of local wine, and found herself laughing, quietly, at nothing in particular. At the sheer, absurd distance between the woman who had booked that trip in October, hoping to surprise a husband who no longer wanted her, and the woman standing there a year later, having built and executed a plan so precise it had reorganized a company's leadership and closed out a marriage on her own terms. She did not miss Daniel. She missed, sometimes, the version of her own life she'd believed she was living before that January. But she did not miss him. She thinks, when she lets herself think about it at all, that the hardest part was never the plan itself. The plan, once she understood the shape of it, was almost mechanical. Gather the record, protect the assets, let the timeline do what timelines do. The hardest part was the 11 days before the plan even began, standing at that stove stirring soup she couldn't eat, saying, "That's wonderful, honey," to a man who had no idea what she already knew. That was the version of herself she was proudest of, in the end, not the woman who walked into a ballroom with 31 pages of documentation, but the woman who found, in that single unbearable week, the discipline to say nothing until she had something worth saying. She keeps one more thing in that fireproof box, tucked behind Harold's report and the prenup, and Harold's Christmas card. A printed photo of the porch swing, taken the afternoon she finished repairing it, the drill still sitting on the top step beside her sneakers. She doesn't look at it often, but she likes knowing it's there, proof that some things, once broken, really can be fixed by the person who was left holding them, without needing anyone else's help at all. If you've ever had to get even, or if you're in the middle of building your own plan right now, tell me about it in the comments below. And if this story kept you here until the end, you already know where to find the next one. Welcome back to the vault.